Hi, and welcome to Change from the Centre. As you can see by the clip at the bottom, I'm Martin Curtis. And what I thought I'd do, because this is the first edition of Change from the Centre, is talk a little bit about what I want to do with this podcast, but also to um, talk about one issue which I think is fundamental to the issues we face in UK politics at the moment, which is political leadership. I start from the basis that I think politics is broken, and that's part of the reason why we see the rise of the left and the rise of the right in the UK. So by the right, I mean Reform UK, and by the left, I mean the Green Party and whatever this thing that Jeremy Corbyn has set up is going to be called. Although I don't think that is going to have many legs because I think the Greens have stolen the thunder, to be honest. But the issue is that because politics is broken, there are so many things that people are unsure about. Our economy is not doing and achieving in the way that it should be. It's very, very easy for people like Farage to exploit that, find something to blame, and then exploit that in order to drag people in his direction. The problem is there's a lot of the time there's not a lot of fact behind it. And, I talked about Farage, and of course he's using immigration. But on the left, you see the same thing, and you see them basically blaming big business, blaming the rich and all those things. And from my perspective, the solutions to our problem are not in the right or left. The further extreme you go, the less practical the solutions are. And that's extremes at both ends. And I'm not saying that Farage and the Greens are at those extremes, but they are certainly taking our politics in that direction. So I want to talk about how the centre ground can play a role, basically through people within the centre recognising that this fundamental issue exists with British politics, that it's not trusted and not delivered. Start to think about why we're not delivering the solutions that we should, and why the country is in a bit of turmoil as a result. And what I want to do that by is exploring some of the issues of the day. So as an issue becomes current. So, for example, there's this thing called a budget going on next week. Do a podcast that covers the budget and offers a critique of the budget. But at the same time, I want to find time to focus on some single issues as an example. So I'll give you a couple that I want to focus on sometime in the future. One is looked after children. Our system for looked after children is awful. And you can see the evidence all over the place. It's not just about the grooming gangs and the fact that the people they exploited were by and large looked after children. But it's also the fact that care leavers are more likely to end up in prison than any other area of the population, basically. So that's something we need to deal with and start thinking about. And part of that is about learning from overseas. And I would say Sky News have done some great stuff on this recently. And if you go back onto Sky News and have a look at it, one of the people whose name I've forgotten, so apologies, said on there, which is something I've been saying for a long time, is we need to start looking overseas and looking at who is getting the best out of their children in care, who's producing the most the most confident young people out of their care system, young people that contribute to society and arguably excel as well as a consequence of them being taken into care. And I've touched on it a bit before, but another issue as an example I want to cover is prisons. Our prison system doesn't work. We're sending people into prison basically so that they learn to be better criminals and come out and repeat offend. And we need to start thinking twice about it. And in both of those things, looked after children and with prisons, we've got the ability to fundamentally change things for the better so that in, say, 10, 15 years' time, we start to save money. and we, making our system more efficient, making our system work as it should do, will save us money that we can then either put into tax refunds or into funding growth and public services. David Cameron called it sharing the proceeds of growth, and it's something I'm a little bit of a fan of. So who am I? I'm Martin Curtis. As I said, you can see that from the logo down there. So I'm a former Conservative Party member. I'm a former Conservative council leader, and I'm a former parliamentary candidate for the Conservative Party. And I know you're probably thinking exactly what loads of people have said to me in the past. I don't look like a Tory. So what? And the reality is the word former in all of that is really, really important, because as the Conservative Party drifted to the right, which started basically with Boris Johnson getting rid of all the One Nationists in the party, basically his purge, but has continued since as the party tries to more and more to out Farage and doesn't succeed. There was a point where I just felt that the party had left me, and so I resigned my membership. I'd love the party to come back, and so that I could rejoin, but I won't do it until I'm confident that One Nationism is at the heart of the party, because I am fundamentally a One Nationist, but also a pragmatist. So one of the things I realize is that if you follow a straight one nation agenda, that you're never going to fix everything. You do have to share a few ideas and bring ideas in from elsewhere. And from my perspective, that means from the centre ground. If you don't do that, you become just like the extremes do. The more and more you push to the extremes, the more you become focused on political ideals, rather than the practicalities of where we are. So that's who I am. And the one issue I want to cover today, having done that, is political leadership. I do believe that we've got a leadership crisis within the country, and that's part of the reason for where we are. It's not necessarily the fault of the leaders. It's partly the fault of a political system that hasn't changed for probably 150 years almost, but certainly a political system that has existed for a long, long time and is drastically in need of change. But there is an issue about the quality and the type of leadership we've got. Let me give you an example. Let's go back. I'll give you three examples, really. Two I'm going to focus on mostly. The first one is Margaret Thatcher. Now, that's all the left wingers and all the Labour Party members turn the off button. But I and I accept not everything she did was right, and I will come to Tony Blair later on. But actually, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, our country was in absolute crisis. We were the sick man of Europe. We had just had the winter of discontent. The Labour government had to go to the IMF cap in hand to bail us out. And Margaret Thatcher came in and she turned all that around. Some of what she did was very harsh, but I think it probably needed to be harsh at the time. But she did do it, and she did it with a lot of strength of character. If you go back and look at some of her speeches, the conference speech where she said the lady's not for turning, it's a great example. Now, as I said, she made mistakes. A lot of her mistakes were subsequent to that, I believe, but she did turn the country around. And it's okay historically that some people do try and slam Margaret Thatcher. There's a reason why she won 3 elections. There's a reality, although the second election was a lot about the Falklands War as well. But when Margaret came to power, she had some, the thing people saw, she had an element of charisma. She had some strength of character. She had some new thinking, and she'd certainly put the Conservative Party in a place where it was electable. And it's very similar with Tony Blair. You think about when Tony Blair came to power in 97, the Conservative Party had fallen apart. John Major had been unable to lead them, partly because largely because the Conservative Party was not able to be led. And John Major, I think he would have been a great Prime Minister if he'd been able to do what he wanted to do. But instead, he spent his whole time fighting and pulling two wings of the party together. History's repeating itself at the moment. But Tony Blair came in the light of that with some fresh ideas. He'd managed to sort the Labour Party out, so it was electable, so he'd taken control and managed to bring the right to dominance. And I think that was important. And you compare, what he did with and how he did it. There's some real comparisons actually with Margaret Thatcher to a certain extent. The right of the Conservative Party liked to claim Margaret Thatcher as one of hers. But if you look at what Margaret Thatcher did when she came to power, she had a real balanced and mixed cabinet. She had a lot of what we would now call one nationists, what they call wets at the time in the cabinet, as well as the right wingers within the party. And she let them run and do things. And it was that mix that made a difference, basically. And it was that mix that allowed, that contributed significantly to her success, as well as her own personality and her own thinking. And that's similar with Tony Blair, and he came in and he'd managed, and he had a mixed cabinet. I think Robin Cook was quite a lefty, to be fair. And look what he did. He was foreign secretary. So, and I would put Cameron in a similar bracket to that, to be fair. And Cameron, unfortunately, Tony Blair. The thing Tony Blair did was inherited a great economy. David Cameron inherited an economy on his knees, and he had to do some real tough stuff to turn that around, including austerity. And there's some arguments about whether he went too far and other things. But by the time he was out of office, we were starting to recover from it. And then a few years later, COVID came along, which obviously didn't help and put us back a little bit. But the ability to stand by it, to stick to your guns, to turn the economy around, was something that was really important. And there's an issue that we don't have that anymore. We don't seem to have those leaders coming forward. And, that's something we need to explore is why is that? And we need to have some conversations about it. And what is it that gives us that ability to lead? But there's something else alongside that. If you think about that period that I've just discussed, the period from Margaret Thatcher through to John Major, through to Tony Blair, through to Gordon Brown, through to David Cameron, that was a period of 37 years, and we had 5 prime ministers. If you look at the period now from 2016 to today, that's just 9 years, and we've also had 5 prime ministers. So what does that mean? Well, as a prime minister, if you've got an average lifespan of 7 years, at least you can start thinking forward, and at least you can get to a point where some of your projects are starting to be delivered, and some of the infrastructure needs you can focus on. If you've got a lifespan of 2 years, all you're doing is firefighting all the time and trying to keep people off your back, and you're not able to focus on the stuff you need to focus on. And that's a real issue with our politics at the moment. And, you think Keir Starmer, it's looking like if the local elections don't go well next May, that Keir Starmer's on his way out. And that's not good for anybody. It's not just about Keir Starmer. It's also about the teams underneath him. So if you think about, as an example, every time prime ministers change, what also changes is the team beneath him changes. Every time the prime minister has a reshuffle because somebody's had to resign, or sometimes because prime ministers feel there's a need for a change, the personalities underneath change. So as an example, we're hearing quite often that we've had more than one justice minister a year, I think is one of the things. Certainly more than one housing minister a year. And that instability is not good. It's really, really bad for the civil service because they don't know which way to turn. And so, we need to start exploring that. And for me, part of the reason for that is a thing I like to call fellowship. So I don't believe we have a system with political leadership at the moment. And this is really, really true when you start looking at local government. And it's not just prime ministers, cabinet members. This is members of parliament as community leaders and as political leaders and political voices of the communities they serve. And that's why I said it also relates to councillors. All too often, what they're doing now is they're listening to that vocal voice that is able to use social media now in a really effective way. And they're listening to that voice and considering it as a majority, when often what they are is a vocal minority. And that means that they're basically following their communities in the way they vote. That's not how it used to happen, and that's not how it should happen. A good politician should be using his political nous. They should be using the political instincts, their ability to research, to take those issues that people are saying to them, but actually to dig underneath them and look at their own values and make decisions on how they vote based on those values. And that doesn't happen anymore, or it does happen sometimes, but all too often it doesn't, and that is causing some issues. There's whipping underneath that, which makes it more complex, and there's no two ways about that. But increasingly, our politicians are voting against the whip, and all too often when they do so, it is because of this fellowship, not leadership issue that I've talked about. There are benefits to whipping, and I'm sure we'll explore that sometime later on. But there are disbenefits too. And we have a political system where we seem to have got the balance around that right, in that there's an expectation that sometimes people's consciences are going to get the better of them and they're going to vote elsewhere. Not always the consciences. Sometimes it's the voice of the constituents gets the better of them. So that those issues around leadership, I think we need to start talking about, because if we are to fix the infrastructure issues that we've got in this country, our inability to deliver any project on time and on budget, HS2 is the perfect example. It's an absolute disaster of a project, and it should have been delivered and running by now, and it just isn't. But there's so many others of those, and we just don't deliver them, and we don't do them well enough, and we need to start learning that. But one of the things is we need political leadership to make that happen, and political leaders who are going to bite the bullet and get things done. And we need to start exploring what that system should look like in order to make that happen. So that's all I've got to say today. What I would say is it is going out on a number of different platforms. I would ask for you to do all the things those platforms that you can do on those platforms, like, share, subscribes, all those things, so that you can, so that I can sort of spread the message a little bit, because the only way it spreads is by people knowing that it exists, but also by you coming back. And what I'd like to do eventually is, if this goes well, I'd like to be able to fund a bit of research to go back into some of the issues, because I don't think we're researching some of the stuff around, as an example, around proportional representation, which I think is increasingly becoming a must in this country. But political representation based on a restructuring, that my instinct of restructuring really that involves and brings in regional government and House of Lords reform, and pulls all that together. So that's where I am. So please do like, share, and all those things. And if you've enjoyed watching it, please come back. But whether you've enjoyed it or not, thank you very, very much for watching. I really do appreciate the fact that you've taken your time to look at this aging hippie talk about centre ground politics.